This is the Radical BCBA, and welcome to the Radical Corner. I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about ABA, maybe some occupational therapy, and maybe just a little bit of how to understand what I do and what I'm trying to do as the Radical BCBA. I want to first start off with my journey. Right after high school, I became a nurse assistant because my dad was really interested in becoming a nurse himself. So I learned a little bit of the healthcare field and what it was to help people. I was really intrigued and interested in becoming a teacher prior to getting into the nursing aspect, but I guess I kind of felt that there were some limitations to that. So I went into an LVN program, but first, the requirement was to become a nurse assistant. When I became a nurse assistant, I started working in the hospitals, which just gave me that leeway to enter into the medical field. The LVM program that I was in and actually ended up closing, and I got pregnant, kind of focused on being a mom, but I knew at the end of the day I couldn't just work as a nurse assistant. I really wanted to go back to school and I love learning. So I ended up getting an associate's in occupational therapy when I learned about what OT was, speech and PT, when I was working in a rehab unit as a nurse assistant. And it just seemed really fun. They had a really cool gym, they had a lot of equipment, and the differences between PT and OT was something that I was kind of trying to test out before determining that I think OT was my go-to because I get to support people meeting, reaching independence and in a meaningful way. Really looking into not just ADLs, but IADLs, and then being able to work with all different types of population, different diagnosis. And then, of course, at some point when you're working in pediatric settings, you're running across other behavior aspects as well. So OT really helped me understand the body as a whole. But one thing that I can say is that they don't really teach us a lot about how to support behaviors. So that was something that I kind of learned on my own, right? And as a human myself, understanding how to better support someone through their emotions, through their behaviors, but not really truly having a full understanding myself because I am neurodivergent, I am ADHD, and I struggle with the same thing. So it was a very interesting experience my first year when I was practicing occupational therapy and seeing more children on the spectrum, really learning and trying to dive into more of what autism is because it's very new to me around 2019. It was just new, right? All of a sudden, there's an increase in awareness in this. Of course, we do know anatomy, we know physiology, and then when it's time to get your continuing education, that's where you kind of get to make a decision of like, ooh, where do I want to kind of specialize in? Because of course, school's just there to give you the basics, right? And then you grow and you flourish from there. After I started to really get into neurology, and I did NDT courses, I did feeding courses, I did sensory. It was just like, wow, I really want to dive deep into a lot of these concepts because it's like finding those missing pieces to the puzzle of what it is to work with the human as a whole. And I love that about occupational therapy. It really does focus a lot on that. But one thing that, again, I was still missing is understanding the concept of how is behavior reinforced, right? Now that I have the wording for that now that I became a BCBA. And yes, I was able to help a lot of children, many actually. So anytime a child was experiencing pretty intense behaviors, a lot of times those children were assigned to me because I understood them. If you think about how to regulate and if you think about providing safe environments, it's pretty easy for me to support them in that sense, regulate, co-regulate with them, and just learn about who they are. Before becoming a BCBA, I did consider going into either psychology, mental health, a counselor, all those things. But then, because I worked in a multidisciplinary clinic, PTOT, speech, and ABA, I was like, well, what is ABA, right? I know y'all work with behaviors, but what is it? The thing about it was there was two different buildings. ABA was still associated with us, but the two different buildings were pretty close to each other, like you could walking distance. But we didn't really get to learn. We didn't really collaborate as much with them, but we should have. I asked if I could shadow. I was really interested in it. It's a growing field. And the first thing that I had asked the BCBA was, do you love your job? And the first thing that she told me was, I absolutely love my job. And, kind of shown me a little bit of what they do and a little description of the science, not too much. But I was like, okay, great. This is something I'm really interested in. Decided to go into ABA not knowing what it truly was, but once I dove deep into the science, y'all, it was beautiful. And I think the science is great. The way the science is being applied isn't, but the science overall is great. It's like our foundation. But the way it's being receptively understood or the way it's being applied, there's not a huge emphasis in our school settings. So it's not so much that I'm trying to have BCBAs, ABA practitioners take over occupational therapy. Occupational therapy is way more broad than just sensory. Sensory is just that continuing education piece that OTs take. Not too sure now if programs are associating more of sensory into their programming, but when I went and my wife went into her master's program, for sure we would say sensory was again a continuing education part, not part of our full curriculum as we're learning. So OT is more about the anatomy, strengthening, coordination. We dive more into cognitive, we dive into visual motor skills, we dive into motor planning, different aspects, not just sensory. So when I try to bring sensory into ABA, we're going to understand it in a different way. Sensory and occupational therapy is about integrating, it's about supporting the body in processing, sensory processing, exposing them with different protocols that we're trained in that do require someone to be an expert in them because we can create aversive experiences. But learning about the science in ABA has really supported how sensory could be identified through observation, how preferences are huge when it comes to learning and teaching strategies. What is missing in ABA is understanding sensory, because that is a form of behavior that is being stimulated through again, our sensory systems. So, in order for someone to understand why behaviors are occurring or the way things are being processed, is through our sensory system. In order for us to have control, right? In general, not control in our experiment, not control over the child. Let's not get those words confused. In order for us to understand stimulus control, why a behavior is responding or how we can teach a behavior to respond to stimuli, which again, being stimulated through our senses, we hear things, we see things, we smell things, we touch things. Those are all experiences that we engage in or that our body senses or our body processes through the sensory system to gain control and understanding our environment. It really helps BCBA ABA practitioners understand that we can use a preference of sensory to teach, and maybe we don't always have to fade out prompting. At the end of the day, can we teach them how to adapt to the environment using preferences based on identifying it through their sensory systems, right? So at the end of the day, stimulus control happens through our sensory system. Our senses are being triggered by stimuli in our environment. If we hear it, see it, if we get proprioception feedback, if we get vestibular sensation, movement, if we try to gatekeep sensory, it's also not only preventing a better way to understand our learners, it's preventing the opportunity for us individuals to understand our own body, our own preferences, how I can regulate with proprioception, how I am an organism just as much as my learner, just as much as an occupational therapist, just as much as a neurologist that understand sensory. We have every right as individuals to understand the sensory system, sensory processing, stimulus control, how do we learn, and how do we navigate our environment using the senses that are provided for us to stay safe, navigate, learn things, regulate, understand when we're hungry, understand when we're thirsty, understanding our body in a deeper sense. Because the more we understand about ourselves, the more awareness we bring upon ourselves, then we can learn best and support others because that's what we do as clinicians, as practitioners. So I wanted to be very clear in the difference between what occupational therapy does with sensory and sensory integration, which we have a bunch of protocols. If y'all could think about them, we have astronaut protocol, we have the brushing protocol. We have so many protocols associated to integration. But in ABA, the way we're trying to understand it is how to access stimulus control, how stimulus control happens. Stimulus control basically means we're responding to stimuli accurately. If I see a stop sign, I gotta stop, right? If not, it's unsafe, right? I want stimulus control to occur for someone learning how to drive. So when they see that stop sign, they stop. And we're using our senses to identify those things because when you're in the car, you're experiencing a lot of stimulation. You see that red light, pleasant music is blasting, you have your maps on, you are trying to navigate through your environment. We have to then work towards that processing through our sensory systems. And so stimulus control happens through our sensory system, feeding happens through our sensory system, all behaviors happen through our sensory system. You can name a behavior and we are processing it through our sensory system. That is the missing piece to ABA. And my mission as the Radical BCBA is to make sure we integrate and understand the sensory system so then we can better understand how stimulus control is achieved and how we can use primary reinforcers like sensory preferences as a way to naturally reinforce. There's so much connection to that. And I wanted to share that for the ABA community, and I wanted to share that for the OT community, and I wanted to share that to everybody else so they know that there's a huge need in sensory, not just for sensory seeking behaviors, not just for kiddos who are aversive to sensory stimulation, but for all of us, even for you as an individual to understand your own body and the way we process things. I wrote a paper called Reconceptualizing Sensory Stimulation in Behavior Analytic Theory. Go check it out at www.themindfullearner.org. You'll be able to access that. I also created the sensory preference assessment that helps identify preferences for children. I also developed an adult version that I'll be showing in the Sensory Brunch Club CEU that I will be having July 10th. Just so, again, educators can learn about their own systems, how to regulate themselves, how to navigate, how to understand their own body, body awareness, and the environment. Thanks for listening.